Welcome back. Now, as you know, this is Let's Talk America, but we're in the midst of what I've been calling the Let's Save America Marathon. So for the last 3 weeks or so, everything we do is focused on the fact that I deeply believe we are now approaching an election, and we've been actually, for good or ill, you and I could talk about that sometime, whether it's for good or ill, but we've actually had the election ongoing for the last several weeks. And it may come as a surprise to some that, 50, 60 million votes have supposedly already been cast? How many of them are good votes, bad votes, tampered votes? I don't know. And it may bollocks up the works to figure it out. But nonetheless, we're in the midst of that season. It's going to culminate in another few days, and then we'll have to deal with the consequences. But what is at stake? That's the question we've been trying to examine with a view that is actually calculated to get people to think beyond what's in it for us, what's in it for this issue, what's in it for this group or that group, even how it impacts certain valid priority concerns that we have. Because I think what's really involved right now, for the first time in my lifetime, though I would almost go so far as to say for the first time in American history, with the possible exception of the Civil War, we're making an existential choice. When the smoke clears, it is quite possible, if we go the wrong way, that America will have already ceased to exist as a free republic. And that's stunning. We could be the generation that drops the ball for good. Think about that. Done, finished, and we're responsible. The very thought of it makes me angry and ashamed. And it ought to make all of us angry and ashamed. Well, my guest today, Alex Newman, is somebody who has been looking at various aspects of this. And I think doing a remarkably good job of trying to help people understand both what's happening in particular areas that are affecting us right now to produce an effect that helps, I think, to terrify us, to dissolve what has usually been ascribed to America as the remarkable, what do we call it? The land of the free and the home of the brave. That means we're a remarkably hardy people willing to face tough circumstances. All the things are being done now to turn us into, I don't know, kind of docile herd animals. Well, what have been referred to by various people as the sheeple. And now it's coming true. Only for the first time I can remember, we're not only being shorn, we're cooperating in the shearing. It's like they handed us a razor and we're happily kind of laying ourselves bare. I don't know, Alex, welcome to the show, by the way. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, well, anyway, I don't have to go into it. What do you think? Step number one of the major issue that we're talking about, what's at stake. But in your mind, what are the things that are now impinging on the liberty, freedom, choices, and character of the American people in a way that may put into jeopardy our ability to sustain our institutions of self-government?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Keyes. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. And I think this election is the outcome, the choices are more clear than they've ever been. On one side, we have maybe an imperfect candidate who believes in America, who believes in our political institutions, who believes in the foundational principles of our republic, the biblical principles that are really at the core of what it means to be American, the idea that God gave us rights, the idea that God created us equal. And on the other side, we have an equally clear vision. They've essentially come out of the closet at this point. Joe Biden has repeatedly talked about his desire to build a new world order. He has repeatedly emphasized his desire to infringe on the Second Amendment, infringe on religious liberty. In fact, he said his top legislative priority was the Equality Act, maybe one of the most monstrous pieces of legislation to ever be filed in our Congress. This would literally unleash federal persecution of the church in America if the church refuses to bend the knee to the LGBT idol and celebrate homosexuality and transgenderism and all these other things. The choices, the distinction between the choices is very clear. But ultimately, I think, Dr. Keyes, this problem started long ago, and so I've been focusing on the education system. I think the education system is what got us to where we are. Slowly, over a period of generations, the American people have been dumbed down. They've been indoctrinated. They've been turned away from God. They've been turned away from the Bible. They've been turned away from America, from their own families, and now we're seeing the fruit of that. We're seeing our young people. In my generation, 70% of millennials now say they are socialists. That's according to a scientific poll commissioned by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. That did not happen in a vacuum. That happened through a systematic, deliberate, targeted effort to brainwash the young people of the United States. Our nation, our political institutions, our civilization will not survive another generation of this indoctrination, of this dumbing down. So I think ultimately what's at stake here is not even just America as a nation, but even civilization, the principles, the biblical principles that created our civilization. It's all on the line. Now, we know the church won't be defeated. The Bible tells us the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. So we know the church will continue with or without America, but the nation, the principles, the freedom, the prosperity, literally all of it is on the line right now.
So I like the way you put that, because the church will continue with or without America. But it seems to me quite clear that it's not at all likely that America will continue without the church, which is to say, without people of character who actually revere the premises of God's authority and the conclusions drawn from those premises in the Declaration of Independence. Now, in terms of the specific things that we're confronted with here, I think that what you're talking about and the kind of brainwashing, let's put it bluntly, that has occurred in our institutions, some of these things that we've been handling, particularly, I think, the COVID so-called crisis, seems particularly geared to taking advantage of the fact that you have produced generations that are prone to think that they wait for instructions from the government and then follow those instructions without question. Things have been happening on campuses that suggest that that's the atmosphere that people at universities are now being educated in, a kind of enforced political correctness that makes it dangerous to give the wrong answer on a test, however well argued it might be. That makes it dangerous to speak freely on a campus, however you may be able to justify your discourse. So the emphasis is no longer on thinking, it's simply on babbling and repeating the nostrums that you've been handed. And then you're handed a certain amount of license in exchange for this to do whatever you want to do in terms of certain private activities, and then use the force of the institutions to enforce some fantasies that result from that, right? And I use the word fantasy advisedly because fantasies aren't necessarily bad things. We love reading novels and going to movies that are based on elaborate fantasies. What we don't particularly care for, though, is being forced to act as if we accept those fantasies as real, forced to approve of those fantasies when they go in directions that are entirely contrary to our conscience and to the laws of nature and nature's God that have informed our polity. I think that there's been an aspect of this whole COVID thing that has had the feeling of wanting to get people to cooperate on a basis that is not scientific, not factual, but simply a kind of submissive respect for power. Am I wrong?
I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, I think the COVID hysteria really revealed something tremendously important about America, and that is the hollowing out of our character, the hollowing out of our churches, the hollowing out of the principles, the foundation of the United States. None of this would have been possible in a biblically informed, biblically literate society, right? To start off with, the primary emotion that they used to convince us to go along with this was fear, right? And we know the Lord has not given us a spirit of fear. In fact, if you're born again, if you're saved, you don't have any fear of death. As I guess you get a promotion, right? I mean, a big deal. And so the idea that we would just surrender all of our liberties, allow our economy to be destroyed, allow our nation to be hollowed out, allow our jobs to evaporate, our small businesses to be shut down, our churches to be hermetically sealed because apparently they're non-essential. Meanwhile, abortions are continuing, the pot shops are still open, the liquor shops are still open, you can still go to Walmart. I mean, it just would have been inconceivable. It reveals the dumbing down of the American people, the fact that we would actually passively submit to these lies. And it's very clear that these are lies. I mean, they've admitted that they were lying. Dr. Fauci said originally, no, don't buy masks. And he said, oh, just kidding, I was lying to you because we wanted to save masks. So they're admitting that they're lying. We know lies come from the father of lies. We are being deceived on a massive scale. But I don't think the COVID is so much the source of the problem. I think all it did was really just reveal what was already there, and that is people who are scared, who have been dumbed down, who have been indoctrinated to, as you pointed out, just passively wait around for the government to give us instructions. The idea that we should just submit to governors or mayors deciding who's essential and who's not, and of course churches are not essential. It tells you everything you need to know about this. And the more you dig down, the more you see it's based on fraud. It's based on lies. It's based on deception. And unfortunately, a very significant segment of the American people went along with it. In fact, I've been studying this stuff for years, and I was shocked. If you had told me in February that most Americans would voluntarily surrender as much liberty as we've surrendered over these last 6 months, I wouldn't have believed you. If you look at the polls, almost all Americans say they don't believe the media. And yet, as soon as the media tells us that you might die from this scary, evil virus, everybody just says, all right, take all our freedoms, shut down our churches. It's simply crazy.
I think you're right. But the way they first approached it struck me as one of those signs that verify what the Bible says. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world, right? That reminds us that the power, the intelligence, the understanding and preparedness that's needed to fight the battle with the one who is in the world, right, is in the hands of Christ and God, not necessarily in our hands. So we need to be consulting with the one who is in us, at least in the Christian sense, dwells in us, if we're to deal with them. Because I thought that this adversary was pretty shrewd this time. At the beginning, the appeal was not exactly to fear for yourself. The appeal that they started with was, you must do thus and such so that the people who are especially vulnerable to this, grandma, grandpa, the elder folks who are up there in years, they're the ones most likely to be hurt. So that appeal was made on the basis of appealing to what is actually a law-abiding sense of the American people. That we take action that even when it's not directly aimed at preserving us, we will do it for the sake of preserving those we love, right? And it's interesting to me that you talked about the spirit of God is not one of cowardice, right? It's one of confidence, love, and a sound mind. I think both were at work in that first response, especially love and a sound mind. You're in sound mind if you take account of your responsibility to do what is for the preservation of others. We do it all the time for family and for people we love. The whole thing was presented that way at first, right? But after carefully suppressing information about how the frontline battle was going and what the therapies were that actually reduced the danger of the virus, they then started to play only on the numbers of the infection and how it was spreading, right? In order to engender fear for your personal life. And so we transitioned. And that was the excuse they used for not letting us get up again when they had told us that there would only be, the brief lockdown to assess how the virus had spread, and then we would go back to work. Since that time, there has been no sense at all that we are acting, as you say, there's no sense at all, except from fear of our own death. Even though the figures show that the rate of recoveries has been, they talked about flattening the curve. No, the rate of recoveries has been going constantly up, and the percentage of deaths has been going constantly down, even with the expanding universe of infections. I find that remarkable. But they don't talk about that. And that tells me that you're entirely right. They're not interested in saving lives, even though they exploited the goodwill of Americans who were willing to act to save lives to lure us at first into this regime. But to keep it going, they have been harping on nothing but death, 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 as if that's the only reality in front of us, an infection which is supposed to increase death, when in fact the opposite has occurred. We found out that we're much more infected than we thought, but there are more and more people recovering rather than dying. That sort of hill has been climbed, and it's been down with death ever since. And on even this worldometer, which in other ways I think reflects the bias of the globalists, they can't tamper with those numbers because it's quite clear that recovery is going up and deaths are going down. What do we do, though, in this immediate environment to get people to wake up to the fact that we're being manipulated this way, that they're encouraging us with what essentially amounts to half-truths and outright lies, to remain imprisoned by fear, when in point of fact, there's no warrant for it except the one they're fabricating, including by ascribing to COVID deaths that actually are due to other causes.
Yeah, and I think that is crucial to being able to get ourselves out of this. That is using the truth to expose the lies. At this point, there is so much truth available. There are so many facts available that show the narrative is ridiculous. To me, it's a wonder that anybody could still believe it. And yet you go to the grocery store, and at least around here, probably half the people are wearing face masks. A lot of people still believe this. But I think the truth is incredibly powerful. The globalists and the deep state, they understand that very well. That is why they have taken to absolutely censoring everything. I mean, they're at the point now where they're literally censoring the elected president of the United States of America, right? President Trump took to Twitter and Facebook to explain that the seasonal flu was generally more deadly than COVID-19. Facebook took his post down. Twitter put a little note underneath saying that the president of the United States was lying. Who do they think they are now to stand in between the American people and their president when it comes to free and open communication? Something's very wrong there, and it tells me that they are absolutely terrified of the truth. Now, a little bit of common sense should have made this obvious many months ago, okay? On the one hand, CNN and some of these mayors, they were literally saying people are murderers if they go outside of their house for non-essential reasons, if they don't do all the monkey dance that we're all supposed to be doing to keep us safe, allegedly, from COVID. And then it was almost like a switch was flipped. The very next day, the very same people who said we were murderers for not obeying all their instructions to the T suddenly said that we were actually racists if we didn't go out and burn down our cities and protest and burn churches and complain against alleged systemic racism of America and all the rest of it. How can it be that one day we're murderers for going outside and the next day we're racists for not going outside? You would think that would have had people thinking, wait a minute, those can't both be true at the same time. And there's so many of these things. I lived most of the last decade in Sweden. The Swedes are they're usually wrong about everything. But on the COVID thing, they took a completely different approach than most of the rest of the world. They said, we're not going to do any of it. No face masks. In fact, the government said, don't wear face masks. They're dangerous. No lockdown. They didn't shut down their schools. They didn't shut down their businesses. They didn't do the anti-social distancing. They didn't ruin their economy. They didn't shut down businesses. Everybody just lived life as normal. You can go on the streets of Stockholm today. You would have no idea that on the other side of the world, unless you were watching the news, that people were cowering in their basements and wearing face masks and social distancing and all the rest of it. And yet, if you look at the government's own data, the death rates of the countries that did the lockdown, including the United States versus Sweden, you see Sweden is doing significantly better, both in terms of cases and in terms of deaths as a percentage of the population. It's so obvious that we're being deceived. And all you really need to get people to recognize this is the truth. And so if we can get the truth out there through shows like yours, I've been doing speeches, in person to try to get this information out there. The truth is an incredibly powerful weapon. I think that needs to be our weapon in this fight against the lies.
Well, I think on a hopeful note, my experience is suggesting that it is percolating out there. and it's quite possibly going to have an effect on decisions people are taking about the election. Of course, some of those decisions, sadly, are going to be counterbalanced and thwarted by some very creative cheating that appears to be rampant all over the place. Now, reports I'm getting from major states like Texas, Florida, California, Michigan, I mean, on a daily basis, things where they're talking about how this apparatus of mail-in ballots combined with drive-by voting, which is a little bit in political terms like a drive-by shooting, right? You're knocking off the integrity of the ballot box. But they're being practiced hither and thither and yon. And it makes me think that the other side of this is that, how can I put this? In some ways, the election's going to require an uprising of common sense. And when I say that, the word common sense doesn't just mean a little practicality about how you do things. It means that you have a common sense of right and wrong, a common sense about things to do and things not to do, right? Things that are consistent with your character and things that debase it. I think there are a lot of people in America who have that kind of common sense. But right now, the churches, if I can call them that, different denominations, people who at least believe that there is God and that his kind of authority has to be respected in terms of our nature and the nature of the world, I see a lot still of hesitation, confusion, timidity, and even a willingness to go along with all this fabricated pseudo-intellectual garbage that is now being foisted off on us as if we should ignore the facts of history and look around a world that has been since, say, the 1860s when the Civil War ended to now, utterly transformed. They're trying to deny it all. It never happened, y'all. And there was no founding that respected God and the constraints on right that he applied, particularly to the way government's to be used and abused. No sense at all of the difference between right and wrong according to God and so forth and so on. And the only culprits that they go after are the culprits that actually succeeded in pushing back the frontiers of abuses in this country. I find that quite ironic. So that they want to tear down Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln and all that right after the Confederate generals. And I used to tell people it was coming, that they weren't really against slavery at all. Final point, I don't think they are against slavery. I think that they're in fact pushing for the reinstitution of slavery, but with a very big difference that ought to make a difference to pretty much everybody. And I'll explain that. We've come down to the break right after we get back. Podcasts are great when you're a multitasking person. You can listen to them around the house, when you're out in the car, when you take a walk. Now we have put our shows on to podcasts, and you can listen to Let's Talk America on podcasts. You can find them at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, and other apps. While you're there, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our new episodes. Thanks for listening and supporting us. Together, we're changing the world. Second week of November, I was privileged to participate in the Red Pill Conference in Mesquite, Nevada. It was sponsored by G.W. Griffin's group, and it brought together a whole array of activists and conservatives thinking through how we can wake people up to what's really going on in this country. There was a whole series of presentations that addressed political issues, issues of health, and other things that are being done to take away our understanding of what's really being done to transform this country into a totalitarian tyranny. If you understand the danger, then you'll want to be watching these DVDs. We're going to put them together in a series. I'll be introducing the different parts of the series, and they'll all be available at imtv.us, the exclusive distributors of this series of views of the Red Pill Conference. Welcome back. Let me say a word or two to those who are watching. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, your comments will appear on the screen of my little laptop here. And I'd be, of course, glad if you all have comments to make and things you want to say, observations. I glance over at it every now and again, which is why sometimes I'm doing the unthinkable and looking away from the camera. But what can I say? It's got to be done. And we have been really helped along by the comments that you've been making. And they have given both me and sometimes when I have repeated them to guests, further fuel for the fire or food for thought, either one, but it's very useful. And it's a participatory sport, kind of, working with the internet, which is one of the things I like about it. That actually, after years and years where we were kind of one-sidedly being spoon-fed things by the so-called major media, you finally have a way of doing things in the world that actually allows, well, common sense to be introduced into what is sometimes just a lot of babble and drivel and tendentious junk. Well, the person I'm talking to, Alex Newman, you must know, is one of those people. I don't like the terms that are being used these days, alternative media and all this sort of stuff. Alternative to what? You know, you use the word alternative to mean that there was something there before. And in terms of the kind of information that's accurate, that has some integrity and so forth, are we really looking at an alternative anymore? Because I think I tune in every now and again, though I can't stand it, to these regular things that are going on, which have now, of course, also gotten their internet establishments going, and you can watch them and so forth. And most of it, when it's not just pure Pravda-style communist, globalist propaganda, most of it is frivolous junk. And they're concentrating on everything but the essentials. It's part of what gave me the idea of doing a show where we are just talking about the rock-bottom stakes of the election, not looking at all the personality interplay and the lying, fabricated issues that they like to deal with and junk like this. No. Just want to talk about what's really at stake, so maybe when the smoke clears, my country will still be alive. That would be good enough for me right now. And if some of the other stuff is not quite dealt with, we'll still be around to deal with it. This would be a good thing, don't you think? And I think we're very much in danger of not having that happen. And I think that Alex Newman, who's my guest today, is somebody who's also very much a part of what I'm thinking of in my own mind, not as the alternative media, but the integrity media. The people who believe that the business of sharing information ought to be thoughtful, ought to be factual, ought to be respectful of the truth. That word that the other side doesn't even want to use anymore. Oh, there's no such thing as truth. Everybody has their own truth, and so forth and so on. That's a world in which everybody with power can get their own result, and all the rest of us have to be spoon-fed a lot of drivel that wouldn't nourish the mind of a flea. Okay? And we've got to be careful of this and not accept it anymore. And Alex, I have to thank you for being one of the people who has decided to help us in that endeavor. Because we'd have to accept it if nothing else was available, which is why the Twitter and Google and all these people spend all their time. They once said we were going to spend all our time getting together with our friends. Now they spend all of their time making sure we can't get together with our friends. This is amazing. They've just totally stood the world on its head, and I find it deeply disturbing that we have been willing, to the extent we have, to put up with it, right? But one thing we haven't talked about yet that I'd like to get into a little bit, because we're obviously getting close to the day. As you survey the scene right now, given what you know, what your priorities are, what you've been thinking about, how does the election shape up to you in terms of what is going on in the voter landscape and what is likely to be the outcome?
Yeah, if we had an honest and fair election counting process, I'm convinced that Donald Trump would win in a landslide. And that's not because every voter who's going to vote for Trump absolutely adores and worships Trump and believes every single thing he believes. It's because, as you said, we want to preserve our country. We want to make sure that we still have an America that we can salvage, that we can work on in the future. And as I travel the country, for example, yesterday I was down in a little town in Florida called Sebring. They had just had a Trump caravan They had 327 vehicles that participated in that. Then the Biden people had a Biden caravan. They got 5 cars, 1 motorcycle, and 1 pickup truck. And I think that's how seriously lopsided the support is. You drive, and I drove all up the East Coast, and even in the blue states, even in the Democrat states, as soon as you're out of the big cities, it's just never-ending seas of Trump signs. You see Trump pickup trucks, cars wrapped in Trump banners. So I think if we had an honest election, Trump would dominate because people recognize now what is at stake. They recognize that we're really talking about whether America is going to survive as a free nation. That's how serious the stakes are. The problem, though, as you mentioned, is I think the Democrats now have become very comfortable with cheating. They recognize now that there are multiple jurisdictions across the United States where cheating, rioting, burning, looting not only is tolerated, it's encouraged. You have Democrat governors and Democrat mayors allowing their cities to be torched. They're handicapping police as these lunatics with purple hair are running around burning down people's homes, burning down, and in minority communities, they claim that Black Lives Matter, then they're going to go torch a bunch of black-owned businesses to prove how much Black Lives Matter, and they're going to handicap the police when they try to protect it. It's ridiculous, and people see this. And so if they're not going to prosecute people who are torching businesses, who are terrorizing communities, the idea that they're going to prosecute people stuffing ballot boxes and hacking voting machines is ludicrous. That's why George Soros has put so much money into electing prosecutors that are amenable to his agenda. So I think the voter fraud in this election is going to be off the charts. I think when Trump said that there were millions of fraudulent votes cast in 2016, the media went crazy. I think that was probably an understatement. I think the levels of voter fraud are getting more and more extreme. Project Veritas just released some new information today proving voter fraud in Texas. These people are getting huge amounts of money to rig the election. So we're going to see massive amounts of that, Dr. Keyes. I think we're going to see more than we've ever seen. And that is the real concern. We know that the deep state, if you will, has been preparing for this election. They're saying basically if Trump calls out election fraud, if Trump questions the integrity of the vote, that's evidence that he's a dictator and that we need the military to go march him out of the White House. So I think no matter what happens, we're going to see some turbulence. If we had an honest election, Trump would win in a landslide. But with all the voter fraud, with all of the rioting and the things going on, I think it's going to be potentially a very rough time in American history.
Well, one of the things that you just said, I think has been confirming what I thought all along. I never believed the polls, by the way, that showed that Biden had leads. But those polls were useful because they then gave some credibility to the polls that showed that they're neck and neck. But I think the truth is that Trump started out ahead, and his lead has been getting bigger and bigger in terms of voters who are actually there, as opposed to the ones being fabricated by various means, technical, ballot stuffing, drive-by. There's drive-by voting now, which I think in terms of the ballot is a little bit like drive-by shootings. They're murdering the integrity of the election with this process. And the reports I've been getting are pretty blatant, where the people come up to cast their vote at some drive-by place. They don't have the wherewithal because they don't have a license, they're not registered and so forth. And somebody will go back inside and they'll bring out a license that they can fill out the information that doesn't correspond to them in any way. So you're basically taking the ballot sheets and filling them up with a lot of junk, probably carefully calculated to represent folks who are either dead or not likely to show up at the polls, right? And it's fascinating. I don't think it's ever been this bad before. But that suggests that there might be, and this is in the hands of God, one way to counteract it. And that is what I think happened in 2016 might happen again. You do have to do a certain amount of thinking ahead to figure out how much cheating you have to do. And the way to nullify that is that it always counts on some notion of how people are going to show up at the polls. And if that notion gets swamped by reality, then in spite of them, the vote is likely to turn out in a way that reflects the real feelings of the people. I've been praying that that will happen, but it requires that people really get motivated who know for a truth that the alternative that's being offered is deadly to us as a free people, that we will not survive these folks if they get their hands on power again. And here's one thing, and you can tell me whether it's far-fetched, but I don't understand, and I've said it many times in the course of this marathon, how you look at people, whether it's Kamala Harris, whether it's AOC, all these people who are socialists, who the Black Lives Matter people, you know, they tout how they're Marxist-Leninists, yes, and trained Marxist-Leninists. And then you have Kamala Harris being a Maoist in her background. Every aspect of her background points to somebody who's been brought up in that particular version of the communist ideology. And when she's actually asked about it, she just giggles and tries to distract from the fact that she's dealing with a fact that while it's going to excite some of the core people on the Democrat side, is anathema to a lot of Americans once they accept it as a reality. But the thing that bothers me most is that these people uniformly are ascribing to an ideology that has as its icons mass murderers. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, Mao was a mass murderer. Lenin was a mass murderer. Stalin was a mass murderer. Ho Chi Minh was a mass murderer. Pol Pot and these people, mass murderers. And I mean gruesome mass murderers. By the tens of millions, mass murderers. And what they want to hold up next to that to try to discredit America is the fact that there were lynchings. You hold the thousands of lynchings up against the tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of people slaughtered by these totalitarian socialist regimes, and you realize how insane it is to suggest that we ought to trade in a society that actually fought its way out of that morass in order to enter into one that is far more gruesome and deadly and total in its devastation? Are people liable to be missing this? Because I just don't believe they do. That's why I think that Trump wins in a landslide, provided we can somehow get past the cheating. And in that respect, to end this little rant, final thought, is the fact that Amy Coney Barrett is going to be sitting there helping to make judgments about what's going on with the fruits of the ballot box some hope that we can see the weeding out of some of the more egregious instances of cheating?
I hope so. I hope they have good reason to fear prosecution for illegal machinations during the election. But, a lot of these prosecutions, normally they would take place at the state and the local level. It's not all that often that the feds necessarily oversee these types of issues. And so that's, I think, one of our big problems. You have so many basically one-party states. You've got New York, you've got California, you've got Illinois, where these people know local prosecutors, state attorney general. They're all in the bag. And so if this gets moved up to the federal level, unfortunately, we have a lot of big problems with our FBI. We've seen that now with Hunter Biden. I mean, we've got all the smoking gun evidence that this guy was in bed with hostile foreign powers, that he's involved in all sorts of deviant sexual activities, criminal sexual activities. It's all out there. Everybody can see it. The media is just pretending it's not there. So that's a big problem. But I think the longer-term danger, and I see a few, I do think Trump is probably going to win re-election, even with all the voter fraud. But I think there's two real dangers here that we face after Trump becomes the president. The revolution is not going to go away. The revolutionaries are going to get more intense. They're going to try to burn down more cities. And over the long term, I think they're very confident of victory because they know right now 75% of America's children are being indoctrinated in a government school system that is preparing them to not only to accept Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, communism, totalitarianism, but is preparing them to embrace it and to help bring it about. Again, you can just look at the polling data. It's crystal clear where this is going. They're literally brainwashing the young people to support communism and to hate America. I think Trump hit the nail on the head in his Independence Day speech. He said the reason for the mayhem in our streets is that our young people are being indoctrinated in the public school system to hate their own country. And I would add to that their families and the Bible and God. The second long-term threat is that I think we're heading into some really serious economic turbulence and beyond that, potentially even divisions that are, we're really reaching Civil War proportion divisions. Now, the establishment, they like to try to make lemonade out of lemons. If they fail to remove Donald Trump from the White House using any means necessary, and I'm convinced if they thought they could march him out of there using the military and an illegitimate coup d'etat, they'd do it in a heartbeat. If they can't, They will allow the value of the dollar to continue plummeting. They will allow the economy. And, if we look at the economy right now, it's in some pretty serious problem. We've had 60 million people who filed for unemployment since these lockdowns started. We've had just in the second quarter of 2020, we had a 33% decline in GDP, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The economic pain that is coming will make the Great Depression look like a little speed bump in the road. And if Donald Trump is in the White House, all they have to say is, see, you voted against globalism, you voted to preserve America, you voted for free markets and for less regulation. Look at what that got you. Now you're in economic pain like nobody alive today has ever experienced in the United States. It's all your fault for voting for Donald Trump. The solution to this is going to be socialism. It's going to be a new world order. It's going to be moving toward globalism. So I think they want to make Donald Trump, if they can't remove him, they want to make him the fall guy for what is coming and then use that to kind of boomerang around in 2024. I think there's some real risks. And again, they've got the young people in their camp already. My generation, even millennials, 70% of us describe ourselves as socialists. The next generation coming behind us is worse. If we want to reverse this, we're going to have to address the education crisis head on, renew real education. That's got to be, first of all, God-centered. God tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You can't have a legitimate education without God, and you can't have a legitimate education without teaching reading the correct way, right? Under Common Core, they're mass manufacturing illiterates on purpose. There's not going to be any way out of this absent divine intervention if we don't address the education crisis. So those are the long-term threats I see, Dr. Keyes. I do think the election will probably go to Donald Trump and maybe even some good Republican victories at the state and even at the congressional level. But the long-term future is not going to be very good if we don't address these other issues.
I think, though, let me try a hypothesis, because sometimes if you've been chugging along and calmly, ruining your life, and you then hit a bump and a real crisis occurs, it can wake you up and get you to say, oh my gosh, I nearly died. I nearly lost everything. What am I doing? This was crazy. I think that the present traumatic situation could have that effect on a lot of Americans. They'll wake up and they'll realize that what they had been taking for granted as a solid sort of structure and an infrastructure for politics and even for economic life, not so, very fragile. Now, I have to tell you that all along, and I'm glad to say throughout my participation in public discourse, politics, everything else, I've always emphasized that though it seems real solid, our way of life is actually quite fragile. And it's based on premises that once they are gone, the whole structure collapses quite quickly because it has nothing to sustain it. It's the fact that we have relied on a certain character, we've relied on a certain initiative, and we've also relied on a certain level of common sense intelligence amongst our people. Break that down. And the whole thing is like, well, a little bit like the Twin Towers. The weight of what is gone, what is collapsing as a result of what you've neglected builds up and up and up until the whole structure just collapses like that. And I think that's a danger we face. But what you're saying, I think, is exactly right. It's a danger we face, but we can make a difference. I'll make a suggestion that would seem silly, but or maybe trivial, but I don't think it is. One of the things we need to do in order to get back our focus in terms of what I would call civic education, that's what they used to call it, is about. And it's sad because I was thinking of saying political education, but that has a connotation because of the way it's been abused that I don't want to have anything to do with. And it's sad because it just means educating people to be citizens, which is right when you have the right understanding, as in our society, of what a citizen's about. But civic education is what they used to call it. But I think the first premise the founders intended for civic education, the first platform that was supposed to make it inevitable that it would happen, was July 4th. And I've often tried to get people, because it's a simple thing, but it's a thing that if you started it right away, and somebody like Trump could think through, get people to think through how he sets an example that takes July 4th from hot dogs and music festivals and all this stuff to what it's supposed to be, which is a day on which our political leaders have the responsibility of reminding people of the basic tenets of America presented in the Declaration of Independence. The reason they're not doing it, though, is because you can't read the Declaration and still accept the notion of separation of church and state that they have falsely imposed on us. So they want everybody to forget that Declaration thing. It's fading anyway. That's why we keep the light on it all the time. They say that it's to preserve it. I wonder if it isn't to make sure that the words disappear and nobody can remember them. But I think that that would be one giant step, because it would also then require that in order to fulfill, and I think it ought to be mandatory, senators, congressmen, people who are elected representatives at all levels ought to be obliged as one of their duties to present a speech on the Declaration of Independence and its fundamental importance to American liberty every 4th of July. It ought to be part of their oath. Because we have people now who, though they purport to be serious supporters of the Constitution, have abandoned the principles of the Revolution the Constitution was informed by, and which the founders say, the principles of the Revolution, in the discussions that took place at the Constitutional Convention. They mentioned this repeatedly, and they used it as a rubric for judging whether proposals were actually achieving the goals they were sent there to achieve. How does this conform to the principles of the Revolution? So the discussion of, should there be 2 houses, what should be the prerogatives of the Senate and the House, the business of having taxation begin in the House, all of these things reflected basic premises about how you maintain the authority and responsibility of the representatives of the people, and how you make them toe the line to be representatives of the people. So I think that proposal and all that it represents, because in order to fulfill that duty, you would have to restore to classrooms and universities a capacity for people to understand what's going on. And I noticed the other day that Pompeo gave a speech in which he was talking about, it was a part of a series of articles on commemorating the Federalist Papers, right? And so the idea was that the folks giving the speech were to talk about the Federalist approach. And I found it interesting. There was nothing wrong exactly with the speech itself, but I found it interesting that at the beginning, he said that at the time of the Federalist Papers, the first concern that the founders had was with our security. And that meant military strength, right? And that, of course, is not at all true. That's not the way it was. And I think the Constitution itself tells us that. I walked through people through this the other day, because the first things listed in the Constitution are to form a more perfect union. And then you have to go back to the Declaration to find out what were they united about. They were united about the premises presented in that Declaration, right? And the understanding of government as constrained and as having the purpose of securing rights according to God's endowment, not human power and who won the last battle. And so if you started and looked seriously at what the Constitution actually says, which the founders did, you have to go back to the Declaration. Otherwise, you're not doing justice. You can make a statement that is palpably wrong even when you read the words of the Constitution. Security didn't come, it came after domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, right? So that means there were 3 things you had to think through, because they are the things you're defending with that army. They are the things you're defending with that military power. And if you don't understand those things, then what are you doing? I think a day that drove people back and then forced our educationists to start taking seriously the capacity to present understandable, cogent, logical, and moving presentations that reminded people of the actual nature of the founding. I think that would be a step forward, and it would also help to focus what was happening in our elementary and high schools. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been saying for years now, if I could get Donald Trump to do just one thing, the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu he wrote The Art of War, and in there he explained, and it absolutely right on the money. If you don't know yourself and you don't know your enemy, you're going to lose every single battle. But if you do know yourself and you do know your enemy, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles. Okay, what we need as Americans now, we have forgotten who we are as a people. Your average young American doesn't have any clue about the Declaration of Independence. In fact, they tell the teachers you can't teach the Declaration of Independence because separation of church and state. If you tell the kids their rights come from God and that the government exists to protect your God-given rights, you're breaking the First Amendment, which is, of course, absolutely preposterous. Right. But if we understood who we are as a people, if we understood our history, go back to the Pilgrims, go to the Declaration, go to the Constitution. I mean, these things need to be taught to our young people and to all Americans, unfortunately. We're several generations now into the indoctrination. And then on the other hand, we need to understand who are the enemies of the American people. At this point, I think it's becoming very clear. The communists, the Maoists, the Marxist-Leninists, the totalitarians who want to destroy the foundations of our nation, the God haters, the Jesus haters, the ones who want to destroy the church. And I think one of the most important books of the 20th century was the books Marx and Satan by Pastor Richard Wurmbrand. What he explained is what I think Christians should know intuitively. We're not battling against flesh and blood. This is a demonic ideology that purports to overthrow everything that God has ordained, everything that God has decreed as good, and flip it upside down, to call evil good and good evil. That is absolutely wicked. And so we need to understand as Americans, who is our enemy? Well, yeah, the people who want to overthrow our civilization, who want to overthrow our freedom, the people who, as you explained, want to make us all into slaves. They don't really oppose slavery. In fact, they just want to reinstitute slavery for everyone except themselves. So we need to understand this is a demonic idea. This is completely at odds with what God teaches. And to leave it here, you mentioned something that I thought was great, your hypothesis about what if, we realize, oh my goodness, we were close to death, we almost died. I think a lot of pastors are starting to realize that now. I see pastors all over the country now waking up and saying to their congregations, folks, we're being deceived. We've got to rise up if we're going to protect our nation. We've got to go back to the principles that God has given us in his word. I'm tremendously encouraged by that. And shows like yours that are teaching people the foundations of America, our true history. It's going to be critical if we're going to save this country.
Well, I think you're exactly right. We have unhappily come to the end of our segment here. I do like to tell people, because of the marathon format, if you felt you had additional time, you can always stick around. I've been adopting the attitude of the old night shows that I used to watch when we were around, like Johnny Carson. Guests would come, they'd take up their segment, and then they just move down a chair, and another guest would come, and then a free-for-all would take place with everybody participating. We've done it several times on the show when people had the time. But I know, though, that everybody's busy, and you offered us a certain amount of your time. I'm really grateful for it, and I hope that you'll come back at some point and share further, because you were right. I mean, the articulation that you give, fleshed out by information that I think is valid and priorities that I think are essential and absolutely necessary. People forget that sometimes that a building is not just what you see on the outside. That infrastructure that supports it is often more important in terms of its use and survival than anything else. And I think it's the infrastructure of our self-government that we have allowed to rust, to be degraded, to be torn out in some cases, so that the building, if it continues, will simply collapse. And you're doing yeoman's work, great labor at helping people to understand that in all the writing you do, the books that you have written. I just want to applaud you. Tell people, I know you have a book out there, but you want to remind people of how they can get hold of some of your books?
Sure. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Keyes. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I'd be happy to come back anytime. I have a new book that was just released. Actually, it hasn't even gone out formally on the internet yet. It'll be out in probably a week. It's called Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, focusing in on kind of the establishment players that are really leading our country to ruin. I've got a little bit older one that I co-wrote with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld called Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. I've co-written many other books. I've got many more. I'm a senior editor at the New American Magazine. I'm a contributor and a columnist at the Epic Times. I write for WND. In fact, the first time I ever spoke with you was when I interviewed you for WND about MSNBC, for the Illinois Family Institute, for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, for Freedom Project Media. Write for lots of different organizations, and then I'm the executive director of Public School Exit. Our mission is to get children out of the public schools as quickly as possible, get them into the safe sanctuary of Christian schools, home schools, places where they're going to get a decent, God-centered, classical education. And so people can find me online. I'm on the social media. For now, I haven't been banned yet, shadow banned maybe. But thank you once again for having me, Dr. Keyes. It's been a real honor, a real pleasure, and I look forward to chatting with you again in the hopefully not too distant future.
Same here. God bless you, sir. Godspeed in your work. And for all of you, I think we've been given a lot of food of thought in this conversation, or food for thought in this conversation. We're going to continue this kind of in-depth effort to understand the stakes of the election upcoming right after these messages.